In the summer of 1996, I was sharing an apartment in Huntington, West Virginia. My roommate and I were having similar experiences, but didn't discuss it to each other until I had the scariest moment of my life, supernaturally. What led up to my experience was on different occasions. My roommate and I were having something tapping our feet when we slept. I was sleeping on the couch downstairs one night after falling asleep watching a late-night movie. At the end of the couch were my feet, where I kept feeling a thud, like something was hitting the end of the couch where my feet were. This happened a few times on different late nights. Later, my roommate confided she had something smack her bare feet at night while asleep. One evening, arriving home after work at the local pawn shop where I was a secretary, I walked into the apartment and no one was home. So, I walked through the kitchen where the answering machine was located to check the messages. Something in the apartment felt off to me, like something in the room felt weird. Like someone was there, even though no one was there physically. I can't really put it into words. I checked the machine and had my back turned. All of a sudden, something or someone tapped me very hard 3 times on my right shoulder. Frightened, I didn't dare to turn around. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw what looked like a very long, bony finger with 3 raised bony knuckles. The apparition was kind of cartoonish in that it was blue and green, but real bright. I stood still and really didn't know what to do. Then I heard a voice that haunts me to this day. "Nobody's home," it said in a deep, guttural, angry tone. Calmly, but with the hair on the back of my neck standing up, I walked through the living room and went upstairs to the bedroom and locked the door. About an hour later, my roommate arrived home. I called down to her in a frightened yet excited voice and told her what happened. Being the accepting, ghostly kind of person she is, she believed me and recounted our feet experiences that evening. To this day, I think about what happened to me and it scares me to death. It never bothered me again, and I try not to think about it too much to give it energy to come back for another visit. Whatever it was seemed very large and very tall. I almost felt like it was 7 feet tall or something, and standing behind me in black, almost like a Grim Reaper type of thing, and it felt very evil. I mean very evil. What is that entity? The Reaper Copycat. Hey all, wanted some answers on this particular experience. I researched a lot into it, but they had tiny holy statues that were placed above the fireplace on a little board. One was a Mother Mary along the wall and saw my gran laying in the bedroom next to me, the one I was about to enter. I entered the room next to my gran's. The baby Jesus fell out of my mother's arms onto the floor as I was hopping the statue along the door of the room. As I bent over to pick up the tiny baby Jesus, I looked up to see a black figure about halfway coming out the floor. We had a double bunk bed in that room, and only halfway out of the floor, its waist was in the floor. Its head was almost in line with the top bunk. It was a pitch black figure. It almost looked like the Grim Reaper, if I can put it that way. It had no face, but it looked as if it were wearing a hood. It spoke to me in what a priest said was demonic tone. I was about 16 or 17 when I saw it a second time at my girlfriend's house. I just walked her to her gate and I peeked through because she was always scared walking through her garden. That's when I saw this huge black figure, taller than a 6-foot wall pacing back and forth, the far end of the garden. It then went behind a wall for a few seconds before poking its face out around the corner and then continued pacing up and down until a light went on the next door to her house and it vanished. I would really like to know what the thing is. The Reaper. After being laid off from my job as a school counselor 2 years ago, I started doing in-home sale parties to make some extra money. Usually the parties were local, and I didn't have to drive more than about a half an hour from our home near Fresno, California. One evening, however, I was going to do a party in the San Jose area and agreed to do it because it was a big party and there's more money in that area of California. The drive is long, over 2 hours, and I decided I didn't want to go alone. I took my 21-year-old goddaughter, Mandy, with me for company. The party had gone well and it ended late. It was around midnight by the time we were headed over the Patio Pass. The Patio Pass is a stretch of the 152 freeway between Gilroy and Los Banos. This pass goes through a range of mountains, interestingly enough called the Diablo Range, Devil Range. Driving this pass at night is scary enough because the grade is steep. There are a lot of big trucks and there are no towns or services on that stretch of road. The freeway is flanked on either side by steep hills. I was tired and very glad to have a chatty companion to keep me awake. As I was driving, listening to Mandy gab away, I suddenly saw a figure dangerously close to the white line that signifies the edge of the lane and the shoulder. This was no place for anyone to be walking, much less someone who looked like the individual I saw. The figure was dressed all in black and was not wearing shoes. The only visible part of the person was the legs, which were very white and thin. There was a black hood over the figure's face, and I passed it so quickly I couldn't get much more detail. I immediately started trying to figure out where this person had come from. There was no place that it seemed it could have come from. There were no houses, stores, or even places for a car to pull out anywhere nearby. I immediately told my goddaughter, but she had been looking my direction, talking about something or another. My heart beat faster and I got chills as I tried to logically figure out why a person would be dressed like a Halloween figure and walking at midnight on a very dangerous highway. Surely the truck in front of me had seen this figure. Someone was going to wreck out of fright just seeing this person so close to traffic. Of course, I couldn't turn around to investigate. There was no place to get off the freeway for miles. As I drove, I continued to look for a car that was broken down or some other way to explain where a person would have come from on this highway. There was no explanation that I could find. That night as I drove, despite the company of my goddaughter, I was very tired. Adrenaline pumped through my veins after seeing the dark figure. It seemed it was the only adrenaline that kept me from falling asleep at the wheel that night. I don't know what or who was walking on that highway that night. It could have been a broken down motorist or a practical joker. If it was a person, they were certainly closer to the edge of traffic than anyone in their right mind should have been. I do know, however, that the inability for me to explain this figure away helped keep me awake that night. It made me wonder, had I not seen this Grim Reaper of sorts, would I have fallen asleep at the wheel and had my turn with death that night? I guess I will never know. Was that the Grim Reaper? I was almost 19 years old and my mother and I had an apartment near Waco, Texas. The tenant before us had committed suicide not long before we moved in, so needless to say, we were very nervous about living there. When my mother would be taking a shower, she would feel an odd presence with her in the bathroom. Also, in her bedroom, which was the room this man killed himself in, at night she'd feel someone sit at the end of her bed. One night after my mom went to bed, I was up alone sitting on the couch in the living room. The end of the couch faced directly down the hall. Sitting on the end that faced the hallway, I began to see a tall, skinny, shadow-like creature, possibly the Grim Reaper. He stood to maybe about 6'6.5 feet tall and dressed in all black. He walked back and forth across the hall from my room into the bathroom, then back in the hall and pointed its finger at me. Then suddenly it came towards me fast, and then was gone. After this event, if I was alone there at night, I'd ride my bike down to a friend's house. It scared me so much to be there alone. 4 months after this event, my father committed suicide. Ever since then, when a family member dies, I would see this black figure before it happens. When I was 8, my grandmother died and I would smell her essence everywhere I went. Butterscotch and Dr. Pepper. And also when my father died, when I heard a certain song that he'd like to listen to, I'd smell cigarettes and grease. He was a truck driver, and so I really do believe that my ability, or whatever you wish to call this, is getting stronger every day. My cousin and I both have these things going on, and I don't deny it at all. That I am meant to use this ability to better understand the deceased and other beings that haunt our everyday lives. Any info about how to be closer to the deceased or how to better understand what's going on would be greatly appreciated. If you would like my email to chat about it, please feel free to contact me. And thank you for reading. The Reaper's Jolt. Listen up and let me share you my personal experience. An experience which has stuck with me for the past 20 years, like it happened just yesterday. I will start by describing my living conditions at the time, which may give you a better feel for the surroundings during these events. The year was 1990. I was a Lance Corporal in the U.S. Marine Corps stationed at Camp Luna, North Carolina. I was living in the barracks on base, and contrary to many depictions seen in the movies, our rooms were not open squad bays with 30 Marines each to a cot, but rather decent 3-man rooms with their own bathrooms and actual single-sized beds that we referred to as a rack. Now that I have set the stage for my story, let me begin. I shared a barracks room with one other Marine. At that time, no other Marine was yet assigned for our 3-man room, so it was myself and a fellow Marine named Lance Corporal Gray. Our beds were on opposite sides of the room with about 12 feet between us. Headboards, or where a headboard would be if our beds had them, were facing the outside wall with the exit door to the I woke from a very odd dream. I can't recall anything about that dream, but I awoke lying on my side to find my arms stretched upward, as if I was reaching for the heavens. I know what you're thinking, weird, right? Not so much, since there were times in my life at a young age when I have slept, walked, and talked in my sleep. I think most people would admit to much stranger things. So there I was, lying on my side with one arm stretched out to the heavens. I then rolled over to my stomach to get back to the job of a good night's rest. But as I rolled over, my mind quickly became aware that something was standing right next to me. Something so dark that it was very visible in our darkened room, since the room only had the benefit of a single window which provided no more than a faint moonlit glow, further subdued by heavy curtains, making it barely possible to identify objects in the room, all except for this obvious presence standing next to me. This entity can only be described as a Grim Reaper minus the bladed staff. So black, I cannot fully emphasize the unnatural darknesses it possessed, complete with hooded cloak standing at what may have been just over 6 feet in height and eerily thin in stature. I quickly flipped to my back and yelled, "What the frig?" or a similar version of that phrase. It was there standing right beside me. I attempted to sit up and the Reaper reached out to me, reaching out as if to motion me to go back to sleep. Keep in mind, at this point, I can see and feel the very thin arms of this entity touching me and giving way as I was trying to force myself to sit up against its wishes. It was at that instant I was hit with what I can only describe as electricity. Not like being shocked, but more like hit with a hard jolt of electricity that continued to disrupt my senses, but the effects fade after about 30 or 40 seconds. The first jolt I was able to shake off quickly and yell to my roommate, "Gray, Gray!" I could hear that my yells to my fellow Marine woke him up quickly since he started yelling, "What? Hey, hey!" I was then given another jolt which set me back a few inches to what had to be the most difficult sit-up of my life. I didn't hear Gray for about 30 seconds, but was again fighting to get myself to a sitting position. I was able to force my body up and at this point was sitting on the side of my rack, but soon rewarded with the third jolt. This time jolted stronger than the previous times, so I am now sitting upright on the side of my rack in a heavy daze which I am fighting to clear. My head is leaning down, staring at the dark cloaked entity at what would be around its knees. It is now standing inches in front of me with its hand on my back between my shoulders. A few more seconds go by until Gray went for the light switch. That effort was certainly past due, and since the switch was only 3 feet away, only requiring him to stand up and reach out for the switch. Finally, Gray hit the light switch, but in my dazed state, it appeared to me as if the light traveled through the room, not like your normal turn on the lights, but as if it took a second or two to fill the room with the light. The entity had to get out and get out fast before exposed to the light, and that it did, by jumping over me into the wall behind me, knocking me back down on the rack, scraping its body over my face in doing so. At this point, my senses were clearing up, and I looked to see Lane's Corporal Gray standing at light switch staring at me. Then in a panic, he ran over to the heaving wall lockers which we kept our gear in, throwing them open as if he expected something to jump out. Then he ran into the bathroom. I simply sat there processing what had just happened. Gray slowly walks out of the bathroom and sits down at the end of his rack. For a moment we just looked at each other. I then said to Gray, "What did you see?" To that he responded, "I saw something with 2 limbs stretched out at you." He also told me that when he tried to jump for the lights, he was jolted just as I had been 3 times during the entire ordeal. This slowed his ability to make that desperate lunge for the light switch. The entity did not seem to be aggressive. I got the feeling it was simply watching my odd behavior during my sleep. But when I awoke so quickly, it was caught up in a situation it had to react to. I can tell you that I felt no evil here. I would even go as far as saying it seemed gentle in its movements with no apparent negative vibe. If it wasn't for the mind-scrambling jolts which left me no worse for the wear, I may have considered this a positive experience. There was also something strange with the air in the room I noticed immediately after this incident. The air seemed to be extremely dry, like the moisture in the air was somehow sucked out. I felt like if I didn't open the door and let some fresh air in, my nose was going to start to bleed. A few months later, I was deployed to Desert Storm and never experienced any further activity. Though I was hoping to catch another glimpse of this mysterious entity, I expected it has moved on to the nearest Navy base where it no longer has to worry about light sleeping Marines, not to mention it would only take a fraction of its energy to knock those squids to the ground. Sorry, I couldn't resist taking a shot at my Navy brothers. This entity had 2 abilities worth making note of. The ability to shock or jolt you with energy and completely disrupts your senses for a limited amount of time, and can do so from at least a distance of 10 feet away. This we know since Lance Corporal Gray was jolted from that distance. The ability to fly and travel through walls. When the entity jumped through the wall, I was hit with substantial force, as if it was a running start, but in reality it jumped over me from a standing position, which knocked me back down on the rack. This leads me to believe flight is certainly an ability it has. Now you can go ahead and say it. 2 Marines got their asses kicked by the Grim Reaper. Thank you for taking the time to read my story. I have shared the story of my paranormal experience over the years with many of my friends, and to this day I am asked to tell it time and time again just to see if they get the same amount of goosebumps each time. And to those skeptics out there, I can only say, I hope that if you are ever awakened to the reality that there are things out there which cannot be explained, I truly hope your introduction does not leave you fleeing like you have experienced something you need to keep hidden for fear of being seen as a kook, as you may have currently view those of us who have had such experiences. Again, thank you for reading.
Back in the 1970s, I was living in Southampton, England, and working as a builder. It was a good time for me. I was earning enough money, had a good set of mates, and no family relying on me. I was young and free and enjoying life. My experience with the supernatural goes back to that time. I was on a building project in a village in a new forest called Lyndhurst, and we were working on extending an old hotel, the Lyndhurst Park Hotel. It had just had new owners and they wanted to give it a revamp to go with its new home. I'd always known it as the Grand. Right from the start, something felt wrong. Whenever you went on site, you got the feeling that you weren't supposed to be there, like someone didn't want you there. You'd feel freezing cold, even though it was hot, sunny day. You'd forget things, get confused. A lot of the others said they saw a face watching them from a window in the empty hotel, but I never did see it myself. For me, it was mainly the feelings at first. The hotel is right on the high street, so it's in full view of whoever wants to look. Quite often, passerby would hang out and watch us work, and a lot of the locals would make a habit of it.
I'd always known it as the Grand. Right from the start, something felt wrong. Whenever you went on site, you got the feeling that you weren't supposed to be there, like someone didn't want you there. You'd feel freezing cold, even though it was hot, and a sunny day. You'd forget things, get confused. A lot of the others said they saw a face watching them from a window in the empty hotel, but I never did see it myself. For me, it was mainly the feelings at first. The hotel is right on the high street, so it's in full view of whoever wants to look. Quite often, passerby would hang about and watch us work, and a lot of the locals would make a habit of it. A lot of them less than happy with the extension to the property. After a while, me and the rest began to notice a particular old man staring up at us watching, always on his own, and usually after the light had started to go. He was certainly memorable as his clothes were strange and very old-fashioned, almost like he was in a costume, but subtle. A few times we tried to go down to talk to him, but by the time we got there, he was already gone. Anyway, it was when I was checking on electronics in an older part of the hotel that I had the encounter. I was in a long corridor and saw a figure at the other end. When I called to him, I saw it was the old man, so I challenged him, saying he shouldn't be in here. "You should not be in here," he replied. "Come on, mate. Who are you and why are you here? I'm a builder. You have to go. I am Duke Stakepole, and you have to go." At this point, I tried to touch him, to urge him out. When I did, my whole arm went numb and ice cold. I got this sharp pain in my head, and everything started spinning. The man seemed to grow, and his eyes got bigger and bigger until they filled everything. I woke up to a couple of the other guys over me, asking if I was okay. It was an hour later, and I had a splitting headache. I got checked out by a doctor, but he couldn't explain it. When I eventually told some of the others about it, a couple of them told me about similar experiences they had, which I won't share, as they aren't my stories to tell. About 20 years later, I came to the Lyndhurst Park Hotel to stay for a couple of nights on a weekend holiday to the New Forest. The feeling I had going in there was very strange. I had a restless night and couldn't sleep, so I got up to go and get a nightcap from the bar. I opened the door of my room, looked down the corridor, and standing at the end of it, just standing there and watching me, was the old man, exactly as he was 20 years ago. I stared at him, backed off into my room, packed and left that night. I haven't been back to Lyndhurst since. I got talking to a local historian in the Hobbit pub in Southampton a couple of years ago, and after a few Guinnesses, I related my stories. Apparently, Duke Stackpole had lived and died there in the early 1800s, back when it was a mansion called Glasshaze. According to him, the builders who first worked on turning the place into a hotel would see his ghost regularly, starting fires and telling them to leave. According to local stories, once a year, on the anniversary of his death, music can be heard in parts of the house,
and anyone who finds its source is whisked away to join the Duke's Dance of the Dead. Those are the stories, anyway, and I can't account for any but my own. The one thing I do know is that I won't be returning in a hurry to investigate. Trip to Bearhead Lake. The summer between junior year and senior year of high school, I got to take my best friend with me on a family vacation. I was really excited about it because she got to meet some of our family friends on the way up as we passed through my old state home, Iowa. I also got to take her to one of my favorite places in the world, Ledges State Park. All this was on the way to Minnesota to meet up with the rest of the family. Poor Lindsay ended up getting sick in Ames, so the trip was awful for her. We didn't know how to help other than to give her medicine and try to let her sleep. In Minnesota, we stayed the night in my aunt's apartment with my 2 cousins and my grandma. My friend had a little crush on my eldest cousin at the time, and they got along really well. When it was time to go to bed, she stayed on an air mattress in my cousin's room. I was a little jealous of the fact that my cousin was getting so much attention from my friend, so I had an air mattress to sleep on in the living room myself. In the middle of the night, she came out and woke my mom up. She had a really high fever and she was uncomfortable in my cousin's room. We moved her bed out to the living room and my mom gave her more medicine. The next day, she told me that it wasn't just a fever that woke her up. In fact, she couldn't sleep because of it. She found herself staring at this nightlight the boys had. It was the soft light that would go from white to yellow to green to blue to red. That was the cycle, over and over. She said that while she was watching it, the light would turn colors that weren't in the cycle, such as purple. Her attention was then drawn to the box fan that was blowing near the boys' open closet. She said she heard a growl and the fan was violently knocked over. The growling freaked her out and the fan was broken, so she wanted to sleep in the living room with us. That experience didn't happen to me, but it directly relates to experience I mentioned in Bridget. Plus, it was something that happened on the trip, so I figured it belonged here. I really wish I could get my friend to start submitting experiences on this site too. She has a lot to share. I didn't know what to tell her about the growling. I had experienced dark things around my cousin's previous apartment. I just wasn't surprised that she would hear something like that in their room. I also didn't know how to console her, so I was happy we weren't spending another night there. She was pretty happy about that too. The next day, we went further north. I think we camped in Tikahoshi State Park for a few nights. We visited another place in the world that I hold dearly, Grand Marcis. During our stay in that area, we hung out at Split Rock Lighthouse, where Lindsay drank some Lake Superior water. Her fever promptly subsided, and she felt much better, thankfully. Halfway through our vacation, we left the Tekahushi Grand Marcis area to go to Bearhead Lake State Park to camp for a couple days. Lindsay and I thought Bearhead was pretty creepy. It was always really quiet, even though the park was full of people. There were cars, tents, and camp. I had to go, but she did not. So I left her in the fish cleaning shack to go do my business. The fish cleaning shack was uphill next to the bathroom. This bathroom had running water and showers. It wasn't an outhouse or anything like that, but it was pretty basic structure. The entrances to each side could be seen from fish cleaning shack, as well as the small parking area next to it on the man's side. I went to the woman's side and hurried in. Just like most of the camp, I didn't see anyone in there. I went to the middle stall because it wasn't the handicap stall, but also wasn't the very first one. As I went to do what one does in a bathroom, I heard a car pull up.
Almost as soon as I heard the car, they didn't stop at the first or the big handicap one at the end. They walked directly up to my stall. Under the door, I saw straight-leg blue jeans and large feet wearing what looked like men's running shoes. I admit, I panicked for a moment. It wasn't because I thought maybe a man was in the ladies' room. It was because this person just stopped in front of my door and stood there, facing it, without even checking the other two empty stalls on the other side. I felt vulnerable and alone. I really wasn't sure what I could do if this person tried to force their way in. I didn't even have the nerve to simply say that the stall was occupied. The person never knocked on the door. The feet, the shoes, and even the pants looked like they belonged to a man to me. But I know women can have big feet and wear men's clothes. I don't know who was out there, but they didn't say anything to me. They didn't knock. They just walked up to my door and stood there for what felt like a full minute. After that, they turned and walked right back out. I didn't hear a car start up, and I didn't hear anyone pull away. I was shaken, and I didn't want to be in the bathroom by myself anymore. I got out of the stall, washed my hands, and went straight back to my friend. As soon as I saw her, I asked her if she saw anyone go in the bathroom. I wanted details, and I didn't see a car anywhere nearby. I wanted to know who to look out for because that experience was really creepy. She told me that she saw a car go straight by at one point, but no one stopped at the bathroom. She didn't see anyone go in or out. From where she was standing, she had a clear line of sight to ladies' room door. I had to believe her. I told her what happened, and we avoided that bathroom until the very last day of our visit at Bearhead Lake. On the last day, we had the wild idea of using the showers in that bathroom. There were two of them, and it was safe because there were two of us. What could go wrong? We walked there with everything we needed to get clean and ready for the long trip home. No one was in the bathroom again. We had it all to ourselves. We knew someone was in there before because the floor in the showers were wet and someone had left a pink bottle of Suave in the corner of one of the biggest ones. We were talking and making jokes as we separated into the shower stalls. We were both about to start shampooing our hair when we heard a thump somewhere in the bathroom. I called out to ask if anyone was there, brave only because I had someone with me. My friend and I both peeked out of the shower doors at roughly the same time to see who had come in. There was no one in front of the mirror or the sinks, and we were in the only showers. We tried to laugh it off, but we both agreed that we needed to shower faster. I remember saying that I was pretty creeped out, and Lindsay told me she was too. I think we joked about possibly sharing a shower stall instead of showering separately due to the creepy experience we had just had when another loud noise caught our attention. It sounded like something plastic was slammed down into cement. I looked out, and the Suave bottle that had been there in the corner inside my shower stall was splattered on the ground just outside the shower door. The lid had popped open with the force of its landing, and the pink-colored condition had sprayed out all over the floor. I still didn't see anyone around yet again, and immediately joined my friend in her stall. We took turns showering and kept an eye on the rest of the bathroom. Nothing else happened, but we got clean as fast as we could possibly manage. We didn't want to be in there a second longer than we had to be. What I'm about to tell you really happened, but you have to understand, many believe it did not. I will be honest with you, as I do not lie. This story is real, but you have to understand that on the evening in question, I had a lot to drink. I mean a lot. Probably more than any other time in my life.
even more than the time I chugged half a liter
of white tequila,
just to prove I could do it. There are things I remember clearly about the evening in question, and others I don't. But this one event was very clear.
There were 3 of us, 4 in total, including me. We had decided to get drunk and bought your standard easily packaged liquor and made our way to an old forgotten graveyard that was over 800 yards or so from the old gravel road. We had been there many times before, but only in the past, and we had never brought so much booze with us before. The graveyard is a great place to visit, always a foreboding feeling, and it makes the girls stay really close to you. It is kind of out in the middle of a field, surrounded by trees, which is what makes it odd. Nothing grows around it, but grass and your occasional wildflower here and there. Most of the stones are old, some dates on them, but others do not have them. The oldest we found dated back to 1918. The most recent that I can remember thinking about it was 1932. What is most odd is the number of stones that indicate children were buried there not over the age of 10. On this particular night, we decided and got right to drinking. We played your normal drinking games and did the normal stupid things associated with it. On this night though, we got very drunk, and rather than exit the area to do our business as we had done before, we became lazy and did this on the gravestones and graves. I was the first to pay no mind, and as I was relieving myself on a particularly inviting stone, a friend said I should stop doing that. You know, 'cause it was disrespectful. I, being drunk by then, told them to bugger off, and that dead people should have more important things to worry about or consider. After a short while, it seemed that all except the girls agreed with me and did their business in the same way. I have to admit, looking back, I had not been so drunk, I had never would have done this kind of thing. Not because I would have been worried of anything happening, but because, looking back, it was disrespectful. Later that evening, I was propped up against a stone, and Natasha, one of the girls I had come with, was by my side as I peered through the slits in my eyes at the others and the fire we had built. They were laughing, jumping over the fire, and doing stupid things and the like. Jim, one of my best mates, looked in my direction, and I thought he was going to say something. Instead, his face turned to horror, and he started screaming, "Oh my God, what the fuck is that?" over and over. He backed into the fire about a 3rd time. He said this and tripped and fell into it. It was not a large fire, but his shirt instantly ignited, maybe because he had spilt some of the booze on it. I jumped up at this time, somewhat freaked out that he had been screaming to help him up and put out the flames. As I moved closer, he rolled out of the fire saying, "Oh my God, get it away from me, get it away." The others asked, "Jim, what are you talking about, get it away?" And to this, he only started crying and blubbering. As I attempted to get him off the ground, the others who were doing the same mentioned it was getting very cold. They could not believe how cold it was. I asked them what they were talking about, because it was just as warm as it had been, when a silence fell over my friends. Bob, who was there first, said in a timid voice, Did you hear that?" Stuttering, I looked at him and said, "What?" His face grew ashen. My friend, who was holding Jim up, let go and dropped him. For a second, as if slow motion, everyone paused, and then they all took off on the road, screaming and hollering. Natasha, who had been behind me, started screaming, "Don't leave me!" And some of the others screamed back as they ran, "Run! Oh my God, run!" And so she began to, but as she got closer to me, I was still standing there now, believing they were playing a joke, and she started blubbering. "Oh God, Jim, don't let it hurt me. Please, please, please don't let it hurt me." As Jim slowly stood up, I looked into her eyes with a smile, trying to tell her the joke was up, but as I looked at her, I saw a face full of fear that alone scared me as well. I choked out, "What's wrong?" just in time to hear the most blood-curdling scream I have ever heard. She rushed past me, reaching for Jim's hand, and as she took it, she tripped over my leg, making me lose my balance. I would not have normally done this, except for the fact I was very pissed. I stumbled back, and to this day, I do not know what I tripped on. All I remember is falling backward, and everything going completely black. I awoke the next morning, face down in a ditch, halfway between there and my home. As I stirred, I heard laughter and thought that someone was standing over me. I could barely think and felt like puking. As I stood up, I remember that my clothes were wet and that I smelled of urine. I thought of, great, I urinated on myself while I was passed out. However, upon closer inspection, I was soaked from head to toe with it. I looked around to see who was laughing and believing the same person had probably relieved themselves on me. I saw no one around. I began walking the rest of the way home, and when I got there, after hosing myself off, I called Natasha and asked her what happened the night before. She asked what I was talking about, and I told her what happened. She said no one had gone to the graveyard in over 2 weeks, and had certainly not gone the night before. To this day, I don't even know how to conceive this, or what actually happened that night, or if it actually happened. The 320 Walker. Minnesota nights can be breathtakingly cold, and are normally so dark, you can't see 10 feet in front of you. But when the moon is able to sneak out from behind the winter clouds, its reflection glistens off the snow-covered ground and lights pathways deep into the forest. I grew up along a beautiful lake in a country setting. It was serene and a beautiful place to make childhood memories. However, the house that we lived in had its eccentricities. One particular late-night winter proved that our family was not living in the house. After a couple hours of evening television, our family retired to our separate bedrooms. My brother to his at the end of the hallway, my parents and baby sister to the master and me, the first room off the dining room. It had been a long day, and I was exhausted. As normal, I left my bedroom door open, just a crack, so that my small dog could enter it if he needed to, undetected, and snuggle up for the night. I turned down the bedspread and jumped into my bed, falling asleep immediately. Oddly, I was awakened in the middle of the night. I was not in a daze, as if just coming out of a dream. Rather, I was alert immediately. I glanced at the clock on the dresser, which was glowing 3:20 a.m., in its digital red numbers. The moonlight was filtering through the night. Then I heard a noise in my basement, below my bedroom. It was a familiar noise, but strange at the same time. The basement was not carpeted, but had a full apartment, which used to house the previous owner's son. The apartment was separated from the downstairs laundry by a large, solid wood pocket door, which was always kept open while we lived in the house. The pocket door had been installed many years before on a sturdy metal track which had a distinct rolling sound as the door was opened or closed. This is the noise I heard. I wasn't immediately alarmed by the noise in the basement. My mom had been known to wake up early to do laundry before I was old enough to help. So I listened for a moment, closing my eyes and wanting to go back to sleep. It wasn't until I heard the footsteps on the wooden stairs leading from the basement to the kitchen that I knew this was not my mom. My heart started to race. I listened more intently to the heavy, methodical steps being taken by the intruder as they came closer to the landing in the kitchen at the top of the stairs. The footsteps did not stop at the top of the stairs. They continued across the kitchen in the same rhythm. The sound was eerie and is still vivid in my memory today, 30 years later. They didn't get any louder as they crossed, as I expected they should if the intruder was coming toward my room. All of a sudden, they stopped. Oh my God, the intruder was on the carpet. I yanked my bedding over my head, expecting the worst, barely breathing from the fear that I was to be discovered. I laid there stiffly so that I wouldn't move. There was nothing. My door didn't swing open. No more footsteps, no voices. It seemed like a lifetime, but I gradually dozed off. At the breakfast table the next morning, I nonchalantly asked my mom if she had been up wandering around the previous night. To my amazement, she screamed and started crying. She asked what time. I told her. Through her tears, she said she heard the exact same thing for the past 4 nights at the exact same time. To this day, we have no idea what or who it was, but we didn't hear it again after that conversation. The abandoned mine in the Mendenhall Valley. Most of the paranormal encounters I've shared have occurred in my home. This one, however, took place miles from my home, and only I was the witness. I live in the Mendenhall Valley in Juneau, and the high school I attended is downtown, so it's quite a ride just to get to school and back. Sometimes, my family and I go for a car trip and just drive around downtown out of sheer boredom. On this occasion, it was my parents' anniversary, and my dad wanted to show my mom this neat trail he'd noticed while at work. We all got in the car, me, my brother, and our parents, and drove downtown. The trail leads up one of the mountainsides, and the hike, if you can go all the way, takes about a day. We decided to just walk up the trail to the old entrance to one of the mines that are scattered around here. All of these mines are closed down, and have been for decades. Because of this, they are dusty and dark and just plain creepy. Anyway, once we got to the old mine, outside, there was this little exhibit that showed some of the old tools used in the mines. My parents and brother were checking that out while I wandered around aimlessly. I seemed to have a short attention span. I started kicking this rock around, and it happened to land inside the mine. I followed it, and then I realized where I was. There was this rusted gate that had the sign, "Closed, do not enter," and stuff like that. About 10 feet or so past the gate was this really big pile of rocks that sealed off the rest of the shaft. I'd assumed that this was one of the many mines that had caved in. It was mild afternoon, so when I started to get a chill, I noticed almost right away. The underground wind shifted direction, and instead of blowing towards me, it started to pull me closer to the gate. Inside, I could suddenly see 4 or 5 men dressed in these dirty white shirts and jeans with suspenders. They all had a pick on their shoulder, and they stopped walking as they seemed to notice me watching them. They had no eyes, just these black, empty holes, and I couldn't move. I was suddenly overcome with this feeling of absolute despair and fear. Simultaneously, the men stretched out their free hands and pointed their fingers at me, almost as if they were accusing me of something. Next thing I knew, my mom had a hold of me and was shaking me and yelling, "Tiffany, Tiffany, what's wrong? What happened?" I realized that I was out of the covered entrance to the mine, and I wasn't feeling quite so despairing. I answered my mom with, "I'm fine," or something to that effect. Apparently, while I was watching the men, my parents and brother had started to hike back down to the car. My mom noticed that I wasn't with them and went back to find me. Once she got back to the mine entrance, she heard me making this horrible noise. She told me that she ran and grabbed me, saying that I was deathly white and staring at something that wasn't there, and saying over and over, "I didn't do it. I didn't do it." She pulled me away from the mine, and then I was fine. I don't even remember anything past seeing the men pointing at me, and I told her what I saw, but she didn't see the men and thought that I'd just had an episode or something. I forgot about it and didn't really think of it much. This happened in the middle of the day, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were nowhere near the river or our house. The more I thought about what I'd seen, the more I realized that those men must have died when the mine caved in. Why they accused me of it, I don't know, but I haven't gone there since. At least, not that far up the trail. The lower half is used as an outside run for gym class, and whenever I go on that trail, the spot behind my right ear starts to hurt, and it gets worse and worse until I almost can't stand it. Anyone have any insight into why I might be feeling that? Any input would be welcome.
Before I moved into the house on Willoughby Lane, I never had given the slightest thought to paranormal activities, and had always dismissed it with a wave of the hand and an offhand comment of how such things are scientifically impossible. However, all that changed a few years ago when myself and my newly acquired husband decided to buy an old farmhouse in upstate New York. The real estate agent, while giving us a tour of the home, had in fact related some disturbing information to us. She told us about 20 years ago, a young woman who had lived there with her 2 sons and her father, who apparently was an alcoholic, as well as an abusive parent, had gone missing. Her remains had never been found. There had been almost certain proof that her father had murdered her, and was shortly thereafter tried and sentenced to 10 years in prison, where he had almost died. I thought nothing of this, except for the fact that one day I might be gardening and dig up a little bit more than dirt. However, this did not stop us from buying the home, which was gorgeous, with green shutters, a post and beam barn which was in good repair, and a drive that was lined in grand old maple trees. But my friend, who was indeed a strong believer in the supernatural, strongly advised us that there might be what she called restless spirits residing in the home. Again, me being convinced there was no such thing did not take her warning seriously. After a long day of moving all of our possessions into a newly bought home, I'd fallen asleep in what was soon to be the living room. The movers had helped me bring in our couch, as well as an old rocking chair we had found in the barn. Both my husband and I thought we were able to save the old thing, which was made of oak and not damaged, except for the fact that the seat itself was no longer there. I was snoring away on the couch when I awoke, drowsily, to a consistent creaking. My husband, who was at work, and the movers, who had long since gone home, were absent, leaving me alone in the home. As I looked around, I noticed that the rocking chair was moving, as if someone was in it. Needless to say, I was incredibly scared, and proceeded to throw a book I'd been reading at the chair, or running out of the home. As the weeks passed, more and more of these types of things would happen, all ending with me rather frightened. Things would disappear and reappear without notice, some of which would never be there in the first place. Some of these items consisted of a wide collection of women's jewelry that I occasionally would find in what we found out later used to be a bedroom. Though we converted it into a study, I would hear knockings. Doors would open and shut for no apparent reason. We would occasionally hear the faint creaking of the rocking chair, even though I had insisted it be placed back in the barn. Occasionally, I would hear hushed voices and see flashes of what appeared to be figures out of the corner of my eye. This behavior increased as time passed, till I was starting to get used to it. I even admit to talking with the spirit whenever I was alone in the home. I would always be rewarded with an abrupt cease in all abnormal activity. On the evening of the housewarming party me and my husband were holding, one of my friends came to me in a state of anxiety. They said that they had been in the basement when they saw a woman standing there, staring at them, then turning and vanishing. Myself and a few others hurried down to the basement, where we looked all over, trying to find the woman. What we did find was a hidden cupboard with what was later confirmed to be the remains of Sue Hoover, the woman who disappeared nearly 20 years ago. After this finding, the noises and sightings immediately stopped, and we have yet to hear the slightly disturbing creak of the old rocking chair, which we eventually moved back into the home and repaired. However, I will never forget my experiences that year, and never again doubt the existence of spirits in the physical world again. I'm a great fan of your site, and I've submitted some of my own stories. The other day, I remembered an experience my sister Christy had many years ago. Although I was not a direct witness to this, I was there when she came home in hysterics. She was in such a state that we all thought she was attacked, and we could not get any sense out of her. The story goes like this. Christy had been walking home from a friend's house down a long lane called Langley Lane. On the right-hand side of this lane, there was a field which was used for cattle from a local farm. There was also a book with a large tree hanging over it. The summer before, I think this happened later in the year, as it was quite dark early, a young man had hanged himself from this tree during a fit of depression. I recall that other people have hanged themselves there too, at least one other one that I know of. I think I was about 16 at the time. I'm now 36, and Christy would have been about 11. Anywho, myself and my brother were sat in the house one evening, and that's when we heard Christy loudly banging on the front door to be let in. She was crying hysterically and was trying to talk but couldn't. She was obviously very distressed, and we thought that she had been attacked. When she eventually did calm down, which was sometime later that evening, she told me what had happened. She said that she was walking down Langley Lane when she looked over at the tree and saw a figure hanging from it. She said that the figure was glowing white and had a bend in its neck, like its neck had been broken. She then proceeded to run all the way home, which was a distance of about a quarter of a mile. She did not want to tell her brother, as she thought he would not believe her. Having had experiences myself, I am open-minded and certainly don't feel like she made it up. She has reminded me of something. Once after a good night of hanging out, a group of friends and I decided to go and check it out. When we got there, I immediately felt unwanted. My skin crawled with fear. I kept telling everyone that we were not welcome there. We were only equipped with several lighters, so the shadows were unbelievable. We kept hearing people talk, thinking it was someone else in the hospital. Someone would call out, but nobody would answer. I kept feeling something touch my back, thinking it was my boyfriend. I turned around, but he was a couple of feet away from me. The entire time I was there, I kept telling him that we needed to leave. My friends got annoyed with me, so we decided to leave. As we were leaving the building, I was holding my boyfriend's hand, and something shoved me. I fell so hard that I twisted my ankle. It was swollen for weeks, and my doctor couldn't tell me why. Nothing was broken. It finally healed after 6 months. I still have problems with my ankle to this day. I have an experience that I would like to submit to the website. I've attached it below. After my encounter one late night in August with my sister, I moved 5 times, and in every place, there had been at least one ghost there with us. When I lived in Texas, I moved from Houston to San Antonio. In that move, a ghost that we'd had for a year followed us to our new apartment. After living there for about a year, we discovered a new ghost. This one would hold the bathroom doors closed and knock over items we had on display. The event that completely changed my view of the paranormal happened in August of 2001. It was the early hours of the morning, about 4 a.m., and for some reason, I couldn't sleep. My older sister was on her computer, and she found a bunch of old music files she had downloaded for her history of rock class. Then she came across a Britney Spears parody song, downloaded from a radio station's website. The song itself was actually an E-clip, about 30 to 40 seconds long. We played it, and for some reason the file was corrupt. The words were garbled, playing in a slow, deep, incomprehensible voice. I had chills listening to it play, and when I looked at the counter, it had been playing for over a minute. My sister finally turned it off. She was just as spooked as I was. We moved on, laughing about the look on each other's face. Then about 5 minutes later, we heard 3 soft, solid pounds in the back wall, in the far back of the apartment. Neither one of us said a word. We just listened, trying to explain away in our minds. We lived on the 2nd floor and shared only one wall, and that was not it. Another couple seconds passed by, and the banging jumped to the one long wall we shared, still towards the back of the apartment, but getting closer. We couldn't help but to stare at each other. After that one, we finally decided to ask others if she had heard that. Of course we heard the same thing, and not a minute later, the banging jumped to the room next to us, on the same wall. 3 solid bangs escalating in amplitude. My heart was racing, waiting for the next set, afraid of where it would jump next. A couple of minutes passed, and just as it began to calm down and blame the banging on the maintenance worker that we shared the wall with, the banging suddenly jumped forward to the wall behind the computer. I looked above me to see the ceiling light shaking. Moments later, the banging shot across the room to the balcony. It sounded as if the entire wall was pounded on with one giant fist. 3 echoing pounds later, everything stopped. I checked the sliding doors, and they were locked, thankfully. We both ran into my mother's room, and somehow she was still sleeping. She hadn't heard a thing. That was something I never understood. My baby brother was in the same room with her, door closed, and he heard a soft rumble, and my mother heard nothing. After that experience, I've always been a little on edge. I always think about what would have happened if I'd left the sliding doors unlocked that night, and what the thing was trying to get in. One thing I know for sure is that my ghost from Houston left that night, and the one already there seemed to get more active. Everyone started to hear their name being called, even when no one was around. Luckily, no one ever attempted to communicate with whatever it was. As a matter of fact, we rarely began to answer unless we saw the person who was calling us. 2 years later, after I finished high school, we moved to Iowa when I was accepted to college, and so far, we have not had any strange paranormal occurrences. Eight years ago, myself, my husband, and my brother lived at this home. We were told by the neighbor that no one ever lasts, and we didn't either. Not because of the haunting, but because we needed to come back to Massachusetts for family reasons. Anyway, we lived in this house for 9 months. We were told the AC was broken, and in the Valley of Folsom it gets very hot, but not in our living room. It was always very cool in that part of the home. On one occasion, I was in the bathroom, and after my shower, I was looking towards the mirror, and I saw an orange blur over my shoulder. I turned to look, but it wasn't there. It looked as though it was a face, and it would have been standing at the right height, to where a head would be on a grown man. After a few weeks, I mentioned it to my brother and my husband, and my brother relayed a story about one night, while sound asleep, he was awoken by a very large thud on his bed. He said it felt like a bowling ball had landed on the bed, like someone sat down. He said he was too scared to look, so he fell back to sleep. After a few more months, we found out that the house used to belong to the town doctor that treated inmates from the Folsom prison back in the 1800s. After putting all the info together, we realized we were living in a haunted home. I was hoping to see other stories about the house on this website, but maybe my story will start to flow. When I was 11, my father died from a heart attack in our home. Because of the trauma on my little sister, she witnessed people trying to resuscitate him. Our mother decided to move. We ended up moving just a little bit further down the road, into an older house that had been built in the early 70s. The owner of the house also died in the house many years before. It was a 2-story house, and the bottom level was made of cinder block. I'm guessing because of this, it was the reason that it was always cold downstairs. Luck or unluck would have it that the bottom level would be mine and my sister's rooms. It always was a creepy feeling downstairs. It always felt like you were being watched, but I always just chalked it up to an overactive imagination. Me and my sister both felt uncomfortable in the downstairs area. It consisted of our 2 rooms, a laundry room, and a cellar. One morning, when I was 14, I was standing in front of my dresser and putting on my makeup. Then, I heard a voice come up to my right ear and whisper my name. The fact that on my right side was a wall really freaked me out. I ran upstairs and asked my mom had she called for me. She told me that she had not. I hated sleeping in that room from that time on, and always tried to sleep with the light on, even though it drove my mom nuts. My sister had a similar experience. I was staying at my friend's house one night, and my sister went upstairs to make sure the door leading outside was closed. She said that as she went to place her foot on the bottom step, she said something came up to her and whispered my name. She said that she also experienced things being thrown in the dark when there was no one to throw them, such as a sock. My mom lives there by herself now, and as far as I know, she has never had anything odd happen to her. But whenever I visit, she knows that I will not sleep in the lower bedrooms. I still feel odd in the lower level, but not as bad as I used to. If anyone has any thoughts or suggestions on this, I would love to hear it. Feel free to email me. Hi, I'm 40 years old, and this story is very true. When my brother, sister, and I were young, about 7, 8, or 9, maybe even younger, we used to see what we would call the brown man. He was brown from head to toe. We came to the conclusion he was a shadow spirit, but with a literal brown look, not tucking skin, but visibly brown. His hat, his face, his clothes, and his shoes were all brown, different shades, but all brown. We would see him periodically and take off running when we did, but our parents never would see him. We'd walk from the kitchen and turn the corner, and he'd just be standing there. Sometimes we'd hear the toilet set drop, just little things. After we grew up, My sister was about 25 when she had her first child. She had a girl. My sister's daughter used to what we thought talk to herself when she was about 2 or 3 years old, and my sister decided it was time to ask her who she was talking to, and her daughter told her, Mr. Burgess. This went on for some time. She would play, have tea parties, and sing with him just about every time she was in my parents' home. Well, one day, my niece asked my sister why Mr. Burgess wore brown all the time. Needless to say, that really shook us up, because we thought we saw the brown man. We would tease each other and say, the brown man's behind you, and get a real kick out of it. I've since had 3 children, and my sister another daughter, but they've never come in contact or ever seen the brown man. I've been reading stories on your website for a few years now, and I figure I might as well share some of the experiences which have occurred to me and members of my family, as well as friends. My grandparents have lived in their home for about 45 years now, and she often looks after family and friends when they are ill. My great-grandmother and my great-uncle have both passed away in their home, one in 1979 and the other in 1993. My mother especially can always feel my great-grandmother's presence in the basement, where my grandparents had stored their rocking chair, which has been there since she was staying at their home, and is still there today. You just get an overwhelming feeling that there's someone sitting on the chair, although it has never scared any of us. When my 2 sisters and I were younger, we spent every weekend and a few weeks each summer at my grandparents' place. One time, my older sister and I had been chatting about the house being haunted, and my grandfather got very upset about that. My sister made the comment that she wished that the ghost would prove they were in fact there. We left to go grocery shopping, and when we returned approximately 2 hours later, there were 2 cups out of the cupboard. We had put all the dishes away before going, and the way they were situated on the floor, it was apparent they had fallen. One was a plastic cup which ended up being fine, and the other one was glass which had broken. In fact, there were pieces of glass embedded in the floor through the carpet. We knew that they couldn't have fallen on their own because the cupboards were all closed, and my grandmother stacks her mugs and glasses in stacks of 4 or 5. So there was absolutely no way to explain how 2 fell, and the cupboard doors were shutting behind them. There was nobody who could have done it. My parents do not have the keys to enter my grandparents' place, and my uncle was in Buffalo, New York, and we live in Ottawa, Ontario. My father thinks that my sister got her wish, and she has never made a request like that again. We have no idea how to go about checking the history of our house, but we do believe that our property was once connected to our neighbors. My older sister woke up one night, a few months after we moved in. When she opened her eyes, she saw a boy. She said he looked to be about 10 and was standing in the center of the room. He was wearing a baseball cap and a t-shirt. The way she described it is that he looked real. He wasn't transparent and there was no glow about him. He just looked at him. And she rubbed her eyes because she couldn't believe what she had seen, then rolled over the face away from him and went to sleep. My mother was telling our neighbor about what my sister saw, and the neighbor commented that it sounded like her ghost. Her husband had seen a little boy he described the same as my sister in their attic the day they moved in. Our ghost doesn't bother anyone often, and my big sister is the only one who has ever seen him. We can all feel his presence when he is around. We have a sunroom which had been a garage that the previous owners had converted, which we use as a bedroom. The only place a bed can fit properly to allow people to walk around the room is to place it under the window. So you are literally right at the same height as the windowsill. That room gets very hot during the summer and stays very cold in the winter. We can never get the temperature right, which is a duct problem. The window pretty much stays open throughout the summer, so anyone there can feel if there's wind coming in or not. Anyway, my younger sister, it's her bedroom. has been woken up by the sound of the gate opening and slamming shut on the front porch on a windless night. This doesn't happen very often in our living room and dining room area, which we use as a computer room, has older windows with the sliding locks on both sides that have to be pressed in to open or close the windows. My younger sister and my mother were in the living room one day when it started to rain. Mom told my sister to help her close the windows so no rain gets inside. When they both heard the windows in the computer room start closing, and when they went to get a better look, sure enough, both windows were closed. We live in a bungalow, and there are no walls separating the rooms, only an archway, so they couldn't see the windows. However, they definitely would have seen if anyone had been in the room. I used to work 6 days a week, starting at 5:30 a.m., with Saturdays being a starter shift, so I would usually leave at about 9 or 10 a.m. I would go home and take a nap most Saturdays. My bedroom is in the basement, which is separated into 2 rooms, a rec room and laundry area. Then walking in through those rooms and turning right to go into the very back of the basement is my bedroom. I got home one Saturday and went to lie down. My mom was also lying down in her room, and her room is at the top of the basement staircase. We were the only 2 home. She heard the front door open and footsteps walking around. She figured it was my father or one of my sisters. Whoever came in decided to come down into the basement, open my bedroom door, lie down behind me, and squeeze me. I was so confused, but not in any way paralyzed or afraid. I was too tired to open my eyes and see if anyone was there, but I remember being squeezed pretty tightly. Then the squeezer got up, left my room, and both my mother and I heard the footsteps going up the stairs, then out the front door. I had to use the washroom, so I got up and ended up meeting my mom at the top of the stairs. I scared her because she thought she heard a bag rustling as the footsteps had come upstairs, and she thought it was me leaving the house. We looked outside, and our car was the only one in our driveway. No one else had come home at all, so we had no idea who it could have been, or why it would have wanted to hug or squeeze me. My sister had gotten a helium-filled balloon for her birthday one year, and it was just hanging in the corner on the ceiling in our computer room. I was awake one night surfing the net when I got the distinct impression that something was right behind me. So then I turned around and came face to face with her balloon. It really freaked me out because it had been floating on the ceiling, and it had to lower to the height of a person sitting and cross the room, where it floated just level with my head. I popped the balloon that night. My sister has heard dishes being thrown into the sink at night when she got home from work, and one night saw the shadow of a person looking out into the living room window. When she got home, she walked into the house and discovered everyone sleeping in their bedroom. So she doesn't have a clue as to who had been in the window. She called her boyfriend to come get her because she didn't want to be the only one awake that night. I apologize for the length of this email. As I've mentioned, it is not the most active of hauntings. In fact, no one has really felt uncomfortable before in our home. I still have years of experiences to tell you about. Maybe I'll email again sometime. In 1989, I lived as a single mom in a 2-story townhome. This was in Brea, Kentucky. My bedroom was upstairs and had one window overlooking my front door and the parking lot. David, my next door neighbor who shared his porch with me, one small cement porch with one step up leading to his door into mine. He was number 7, and I was number 8. One time early between 2 and 3 o'clock, I had just startled myself awake after a disturbing dream. I just finished writing it all down in a dream journal and had turned off my bedside lamp. I lay there in darkness with my bedroom window as a nightlight. A bit of streetlight shone through the slightly elevated shade, and if a car happened to go by, I'd see a quick flash of headlights roam through my bedroom walls. The roads were mostly empty, and it was all stillness outside. My window was partly open, and I remember the sound of wind, and an occasional instinct amidst all the quiet. It was summer, or maybe the end of summer, and the fresh air smelled like honeysuckle. As I lay there trying to fall back asleep, I suddenly hear the low growl of a car engine in the parking lot below. It idled for a few minutes, and then turned off. There was silence. Next, the click of a door handle. Then the sound of a door creaking open and slamming shut. I heard shoes hitting the pavement. They had loud, distinct heels on them, pacing each step like I would imagine a sharply dressed woman would do. Clop, clop, coming closer to David and my porch. They made a distinct noise, which echoed in the night air. They walked just below my window. I wondered if the person would knock on David's door, or mine. There was a pregnant pause as I listened for the knock. I guessed the knock would be on David's door, as he was a big late-night partier and had frequently night friends. The knock came, but on my door. I heard it loud and bellowing through my open window from right below it, and simultaneously, it echoed through my apartment. 5 knocks on my front door, sharp and determined. I immediately leaped out of bed and was at the window for a few seconds later. I yelled down to the visitor, "I'll be right there." I had several friends or family it could be, despite this odd hour, so I wasn't concerned. I turned from the window and bounded down my stairs, in the dark, and sprung open my front door. I opened it part way, and then all the way. Only darkness. Just an empty porch. There was no car in the parking lot, as far as my eyes could see. Wind howled through the trees. It just shrieked past my door and blew branches across the pavement. I shuddered. Not from cold, but from the lightning bolt of the creepy chills that were traveling like ice down my spinal cord. I shut the door again and then locked it. Then I stood there for a minute or two and checked the lock again. Slowly I moved again, back up the stairs again, taking each step backward, keeping watch on my front door. Then stood there for a minute or two and checked the lock again. I moved slowly back up the stairs again, taking each step up backward, keeping my watch on my front door. About 4 years ago, when I lived with my mother and her boyfriend in an apartment, I was sleeping ahead. It was about 12 a.m., and suddenly the pillows and blankets morning. When I woke up, I saw that the pillows and blankets had been made into a little pallet on the floor next to me. Also, in that apartment, it was about 10 p.m. I was trying to get some sleep, and I saw a lady in one of those button-up high-collar dresses from a long time ago. I was a little bit freaked, but when I saw her, I was so scared, but kinda happy to see her anyway. Also, about 2 years ago, I was living in a home with my father and my stepmother, and I was walking to my room, and that's when I saw a blonde lady laying on our couch. She was wearing a long light blue dress. At first I thought it might have been my stepmother. Then I realized that she didn't have a light long blue dress. That was when I looked back, and the lady wasn't there anymore, and my stepmother was all the way at the other end of the house on the computer. This time it happened to my father. He was sitting in his chair watching television, and for some reason he looked behind him and saw this little old lady with her hands on her hips, giving him a disapproving look. I'd also see things disappear and turn up in weird places. At first I thought I'd done it, I'm always leaving stuff in odd places, like my shoes in the bathroom behind the towels. But then I realized even I didn't leave things in that weird of places. Once I lost my house keys, I knew I'd left them on my bed, and I was getting ready for bed, and I was getting all the crap off my bed. I realized that my keys weren't there. I looked for them for days, but I never even found them. That is until about 6 months later. We were moving out of the house. My dad was moving the big desk out of my room, and there were my keys. There is no way that I could have kicked them under the desk by accident. It had this weird decoration on the front. The only way that it could have gotten there was from the back, and that was also impossible. My desk was too close to the wall for that. This also happened to my father a few months ago. It was really late at night, or really early in the morning. I don't know, but my father woke up, and then he saw his father standing in his room. He called my aunt, and she told him what happened. This happened about 5 months ago to me. I was sitting in the church during the prayer. I don't know why, but I looked up, and I saw my best friend's dad standing right there, which I knew to be impossible, because he had been dead for about 2 years before the occurrence. This happened about 4 months ago. I was really late. I mean really late. I was having trouble trying to sleep, and I was looking at my window, or rather glaring. But yeah, I was glaring at my window, and I looked at the end of the bed and saw this weird demon-looking creature. Anyways, I totally freaked. I mean, you don't see these weird little creatures every day, you know. Well, ever since I've seen this thing, my favorite clothes have been disappearing. At first I thought they might have been under my bed or in my closet, but they're not. There's nothing under my bed, and I've been through my closet twice. Do you know what that little freaky creature might have been? About 3 months ago, I was at my friend's, and they have crosses everywhere. I mean everywhere. The reason being is that they have problems. These weird glowing like orb ghost things. Well, my friend and her sister and I were sitting on her bed. We were just talking about Stephen King movies, and then I say, "Have you seen It?" And then we hear a creepy voice that says yes. We freaked out. We all jumped into the middle of the bed and didn't move for a long time. Well, the glowing orbs or thingies that we mentioned are supposed to be ghosts, I suppose. Because, a lot of people have died in that house. My friend was up late one night, watching TV, and she looks out her window, and she sees 3 glowing heads. Well, one day, I had come home with her after school, so she could give me a ride to church. I put my backpack in the middle of her bed, and sat on the floor. That way I could watch some televisions before we could go. That's when she was on the other side of the room, by the window, where she saw the glowing heads. And all of a sudden, my backpack flies off the bed and into her closet. It was more like it moved a little bit, and suddenly it was in her closet. It's kind of hard to explain. About a year ago, I was in my friend's grandmother's bathroom. My friend had to shave her legs, and that's when I see this old dog lying on the floor. And that's when I asked, "Did you have a dog that died?" And she was like, "Yeah." "How'd you know?" Then that's when I said, "'Cause it's lying there right on the floor underneath the sink." Turns out that they have several portals, so to speak, in her house. And then there's a ghost and a Ouija board. We don't mess with that. While I was stationed in Germany, I got married to my wife in Denmark. We stayed in a little nice hotel that was built in the 1400s. We stayed a total of 3 nights, and never had a problem until the last night. Late in the last night, I was lying in bed with my new wife. We were both facing a wall away from the door. I said something along the lines of, "I'll always keep you safe." And at that moment, an overwhelming fear came over me at the same time. My wife said, "Why did you just say that?" It had no real reason. But she described to me that she was feeling the same thing I was. And we were able to determine that the source of our unexplained fear was coming from the doorway right behind us. Neither I nor my wife wanted to turn to see if anything was there. When I finally mustered up the courage to look, I was convinced that I was going to be looking directly into the eyes of the devil. But nothing was there, and shortly after the fear subsided, I have jumped out of planes and been to combat twice, but I never felt as scared as I was that night.
I have a confession to make. I'm not an ordinary person. I don't mean that I've exhibited quirky behavior in the past and I'm simply unorthodox. But I have this uncanny ability to sense things. Whether these energies that I've learned to embrace are malevolent or benevolent, I can't say, as I'm unable to clearly make the distinction. But I tend to attract unusual energies, which permeate all around me. If you happen to come in close contact with me, you may be susceptible to these energies as well. I could say that there's a supernatural component to this, but because my mind has relentlessly wreaked havoc on me, I can't say for certain what is going on. Sometimes I see things, shadows, hearing strange noises, knocks on the walls, a faint whisper in my ear, reinforcing the idea that something otherworldly resides inside these walls. All the while I'm sitting in the kitchen of my old Victorian home, and I'm the only one who lives here. I can honestly say that I don't know what is happening, but I have nowhere else to turn to. There's the cellar that I'm terrified to go into. I've literally haven't stepped foot down there since I moved in. But it's like I can telepathically hear the growls and moans coming from that dark space that I refuse to enter. I've always wanted to know if the source of all these energies came from that cellar. The thing is, I've no pets, no estranged relationships. Nobody ever sets foot in my home. I had a wife once, but she's been gone for what seems like a millennium. I don't remember what it's like to interact with anybody. I'm virtually imprisoned. I work from home. So, I became a recluse. I don't go out much these days, for fear of inadvertently transferring these energies to those who come in contact with me. Isolation is unconscionable. The fear of going insane inside my mind constantly lingers in the foreground. The helplessness of not being able to do anything about it still traps me internally. I'm mentally paralyzed. And then I have these unusual nightmares. My doctor tells me they are night terrors. So I'm laying in my bed, and the shadow opens the door. It doesn't do anything, but simply stands in the doorframe. I don't know what it wants, but I can only make out its eyes, glowing brighter than the sun. The rest the outline, a silhouette. I sweat. My body temperature drops, and I feel a cold breath on the right side of my shoulder. I look over, temporarily taking my eyes off the shadow figure, and yet there's nothing there but a mist that looks as if someone is breathing in the cold air. I look back at the doorframe, and the shadow is gone. I then lay down, staring at the ceiling. I simply just can't ignore what's going on. I want to, but even the pills don't do enough. I still see these things, hear these things, and most importantly, feel these things. I'm so scared. I don't want to be a prisoner anymore. I want a release. I want it all to end. I'm sick and tired of the suffering. My mind just won't heal. I don't want to feel. It's almost better if I don't, but I can't turn it off. Still, these images persist. In another moment, I can clearly see this elderly woman silently screaming at me. I can feel the terrible darkness emitting from her, and when she opens her mouth, there is nothing but darkness, almost as if it is a black hole. No sound, just the mouth opening. The woman with her old tattered clothing, not from this time period, definitely not present, Victorian times, with a black dress from that era, long black hair, matted and uncombed. This being was just standing there. I ask it what it wants from me, but it remains silently screaming for a few seconds. I blink my eyes as hard as anybody could. The figure simply won't disappear. I see a single cockroach move out of her mouth. I had to have dreamt this. This night terror felt so real. It consumes me. I can't get it out of my head. I go back and forth thinking this has got to just be a hallucination. But the more I think about these events, the way they truly never disappear, it makes me believe there is an entity in this house that I can't ignore. They are communicating to me through my dreams and through some of my hallucinations that I've had as well. The therapists, the doctors, they all tell me that I've got some psychosis. Trauma from my youth remains unsolved. But these walls inside this old home has so much history engraved into it. Tell me that spirits don't exist, and I can't prove it to you. I can only tell you about my experiences and how sensitive I am to the other side. Then I think to myself, why are we so arrogant about this other side? Why do we dismiss what we do not understand? Maybe I'm just crazy. Or maybe the world wants to shield us from the fact that these beings live among us. If you truly open up your eyes and begin to understand that there's nothing that the world can't see, then you can believe. Growing up in rural Michigan, I had several what the heck was that experiences. Most were minor, a moving shadow or an uneasy feeling, but one stands out. I was 8 to 10 years old in the mid-80s, and my family had just returned from a vacation. When we got out of the car, my dad headed to the mailbox, my mom to her garden, and I lugged my suitcase inside the house. All of the windows were shut, and I pulled the garage door closed behind me. Walking through the house, I passed a bay window, from which I could see my dad still on the road, and my mom picking some vegetables. The house was silent, except for my footsteps on the carpet. I walked into my room and put my suitcase down in the corner. I heard a male voice laughing behind me, maybe in the doorway 8 feet away. It was a hearty laugh, loud and clear. I spun around, and there wasn't anyone in the doorway. I ran back to the garage, through the door, and outside. my father was just grabbing his suitcase from the car, and my mother was pulling weeds. I wasn't scared when I heard the voice, but not having a tangible body to put it with did unnerve me a bit. Following the event, I was able to forget and had no issues in the rest of the house. It was only after I got older and interested in the paranormal did I realize that I must have had a run-in with something. About 2 years ago, I bought a 126-year-old, 8,000 square foot mansion in Missouri, just outside of Kansas City where I grew up. My mother had owned and lived in the house for the previous 15 years, slowly maintaining it. She had done a great job maintaining its mid-1800s character, slowly bringing the woodwork back to life, adding insulation, and replacing all of the plumbing and wiring. I mention this because I've heard that a disturbance in the environment can cause spectral activity to begin. I'd seen the house only once, as I live over 2,000 miles away, but I fell in love with it immediately. The first night I stayed over, I woke in the middle of the night to huge blobs, about a dozen, from golf ball to basketball size, floating around the room I was sleeping in. This is the one and only time I've ever experienced anything like that. I closed my eyes, said a prayer, and fell back to sleep in time. I said nothing to my mother the next day until she asked me, "Well, did you see the blobs?" One of the workers stayed down there the other night and said he wouldn't stay in the house after dark because of the blobs floating around him. She had not seen them, and still hasn't. However, the previous owner told my mother a few years later that he loved what she had done to the front room, but he could never stay in there while the house was his because of the blobs. During the summer of 2007, I went back to see my family. I stayed downstairs again and had several things happen. It is important to note that I've never felt in danger, only uncomfortable. My mom and her boyfriend went upstairs to go to bed. I stayed downstairs in the first floor master suite. For the next 45 minutes, the heavy footsteps above my head were attributed to the two of them settling in for the night. Finally, I decided I would go up and find out what was going on. The entire upstairs was dark and still. They were both lying in bed. I returned to my bedroom to hear the continued walking above me. So, I went out on the living room to sleep on the couch. The walking continued above me, although there is only one attic above that living room. I could also hear a distant, quiet talk between a man and a woman, but I couldn't make out what they were saying, and it seemed to always be somewhere else from where I was. The next morning, I decided maybe I would have a chat with myself out loud, and if anyone else heard it, then maybe it would be for the better. I sat on the end of the bed. It was now daylight, so I felt comfortable to be in the bedroom again, and said that I was the new owner and the son of the woman they probably knew very well by now. I really liked the house and hoped to continue my mother's good work, but for now, I lived elsewhere. I also mentioned something that I don't suggest, but in this situation, I felt comfortable in doing so. I told them that they seemed to have been there a long time, and so long as they agreed to stay out of the bathroom while I was in there, we could get along just fine together. The following night was as quiet as it could be. I think their interest in me was satisfied. This past summer, 2008, was my third visit back. Absolutely nothing happened.
I was ready, and nothing. Hey, that's fine with me. But one side note, my mother sat down to look at an album she had kept for all these years she had been doing the refurbishing. She was showing me the huge change in the house, from walls being ripped out and then rebuilt, and so on. In well over half of the pictures, there were huge light anomalies. There were smears, blobs, and strange twists of the image. I mentioned this to my mother, who looked right at me and said, "You know, I haven't taken a decent picture since I've lived in this house. I've owned one crappy camera after another. All the pictures look like this. I have to throw most of them away because they are no good." I just smiled. Right, Mom. Every digital and disposable camera she has ever had in the past 15 years has had the same problem. I grew up with a mom who is wicked, and she is very psychic. She has told me accurately if a lover and I will break up, when, if I'll meet someone new, and accurate descriptions of people I'll meet. My mother told my roommate that the child she was having would be a girl, and she was correct. My mom, to my amazement, is the real deal. On Halloween, our house is the most popular because the altar my mother sets up outside is very real. It's very fun, and I grew up with an easygoing view of the paranormal. I do tend to be very logical, and I believe in a paranormal experience if it does not seem like someone is BSing me. I keep my mind open. My mother does have headaches if she is around haunted houses. She has migraines that will make her sick for days after being in one. She's had this happen to her several times in her life, including once when I was a kid. A few years ago, when I was 23, I started having heart palpitations and tachycardia. At one point, my heart rate went up to 181. I spent night after night in the emergency room, and I was recommended to a cardiologist. I went through that for several months before finally someone realized it was a sedative that I took that helped me sleep. The doctors took me off the sleep medication, and I soon found out that I had become dependent on sleep aids. At the same time, I had to get on a Greyhound bus for a 2-day trip to move back with my parents because of the health problems. If you've ever traveled on a Greyhound, you know it's really hard to sleep on it. I was sleep deprived. I was told that I was sleeping, but I didn't realize it. I wasn't sleeping through the night. I was exhausted. I was depressed, and I developed a phobia of the sound of a beating heart medication commercials, etc. In short, my mental health was suffering. I had to make the choice to go into a psychiatric ward because it took a month to get an appointment with a psychiatrist. I didn't want to wait that long. The ward was in a regular city hospital. All the patients were quiet and were there to heal. Nobody was dangerous. There were patients with bipolar and other types of mental illness, and nobody was dangerous. There are different levels of hospitals. This was a ward for anybody going through emotional difficulties. I started to sleep the first 2 days I was there. I was not dangerous, but they did have to give me something to sleep. I was having dreams in which in my bathroom, patients had bathrooms in their rooms. I could hear a woman crying and throwing up all night. It was horrible and nightmarish. I could never see her because in the dream,
I was laying in bed. How can I describe this? Even though I was asleep and dreaming, it felt like I was aware of everything going on. It never sounded quiet. It sounded like patients were throwing fits, and that someone would go by my room and rap on the wall with a walker, and that poor woman threw up and cried. She sounded miserable. The ward was actually always quiet. Nobody threw fits at night. My mom had taught me how to interpret dreams. I figured mine showed my anxieties. I'd been through hell. I wanted to sleep, and I never gave one thought to the idea that the place was haunted or had residual hauntings. I had greater concerns at the time. However, my mom came to pick me up, and she refused to enter the ward. I didn't think anything of that either. We were driving home, and she asked me how I had slept, and if I did at all. I told her about the nightmares, and how I was completely loud, and I was still very exhausted. My mother was shocked, and it showed on her face. She said, "Sarah, those were not just dreams. This psychiatric ward used to be a cancer ward." I was getting a migraine because there are patients who have not moved on. Wow, that shocked me. I never heard doctors mention that I had been a cancer ward. The idea was never put into my head. Like I said, I wanted to sleep again and to feel happy. I was concerned for my health. I believe my mom. She's usually incredibly accurate about these kinds of things. I honestly have gotten tired of finding out if me and a potential lover are not going to work out. She's that accurate. However, I could not tell you if that ward was the former cancer ward. I simply don't know because none of the doctors ever mentioned it. I was sleep deprived and going through hell at the time. My emotional state could have been reflected in my dreams. However, if I've learned anything about the paranormal, is that it can be a very small world. The hospital in question is in Iowa. It is a regular city hospital with an emergency room, surgery room, etc. It is not a psychiatric hospital only. If a former nurse ever writes you, or even a former patient, I'm here to tell you that there may have been something to their experience. The ward in question is still open. This was a few years ago that I was there. This is just a quirky experience that I wanted to share. My story has been going on for a couple of years now. When I was 9, we moved into our house. It's a nice little place, backed by a large ditch. Behind the ditch is a large forest that I used to play in. The house itself is unremarkable. It's 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom is the first room you come to when you open the front door, straight in. To the right, there's a door to the garage, and to the left is the room we use as our living room. To the right of that is the dining room, with the entry into the kitchen. From the left of the living room is the hallway, with the bedrooms and the bathroom. From the time when I first moved in, I've never liked the bedroom at the end of the hall. It has a window that looks out into the front yard. The room I shared with my sister has a window that looks out into the backyard. I'm not sure what it is about the room, but it's a creepy feeling. I was around 11 when my older sister moved out. By that time, it had been a while since I'd gotten any creepy feelings in the second bedroom. I was pleased with the idea of having my own room. I moved my bed in there, got everything set up, and prepared for the grown-up life that I wanted. The first couple days were okay. I had strange nightmares about something coming in from the ditch, something I couldn't explain. Finally, after about a month after I'd been sleeping in the room, I woke up suddenly from one of those dreams. I laid there for a while, not really sure of what woke me up. Then, I realized that the music box my grandma had given me a year ago, it was on. The music box was shaped like a carousel horse and had a switch on the bottom of it that turned the music on. I sat up and took it down from the shelf above my head and turned the switch off. I figured that maybe my cat went up on the shelf and brushed against it. I laid back down to go to sleep. It was lying there that I first saw him. I don't know what made me look up into the doorway of my bedroom. At the time, I slept with the door open, but I did, and standing there was a man, clear as day. For a moment, I was sure that someone must have broken into the house. With the light coming off the nightlight near the door, I saw that his mouth was moving quickly, and no sound was coming out. It was almost like he was screaming at me. He took a step forward and vanished. I slept in the living room that night. I finally got the nerve to sleep in my room again. After about a week of sleeping on the sofa, and it vanished when I turned the light on. I ended up spending the next year sleeping on the floor in my sister's room because my mom wouldn't let me move my stuff in with her. I also couldn't change my room without getting the feeling of being watched. I would glance at the mirror, it's the type that sits on the dresser, and see a face staring at me, one that wasn't my own. My older sister finally moved back home, and I ended up back in the other bedroom with my sister. I thought that would make it go away, but I would sometimes see the man standing in the doorway late at night. He'd stand there staring at me, mouth moving, forming words I didn't understand. 3 years ago, some major changes happened. My oldest sister broke up with her husband, lost her house, and had to move in with my mom and dad, along with her 2 kids. My youngest oldest sister had her boyfriend living in the house with her. The living arrangements were my oldest sister's kids slept in the second bedroom with me, and my sister and her boyfriend had the living room. It was weird at first, but we all got used to it. The weird things had calmed down since I moved to the other bedroom, but it picked up again when my sister moved in. I was trying to get some sleep. It was around 1 in the morning, and I saw the child's shape again, but this time, it was sitting at the end of my niece's bed. I sat up, but before I could say anything, my niece woke up screaming. She said it was a nightmare, and I had a feeling it was probably the same one I had when I was younger. They moved out last year, and things calmed down for the most part, until my oldest sister moved away. I now had a bedroom all to myself. I was trying once again to get some sleep. I've always had trouble sleeping in this house, and I looked at my doorway, and the man was standing there, but this time I could hear him whispering. It was gibberish. I turned over and pulled the pillow over my head, but the room got so cold, I ended up turning my TV on and closing my bedroom door. Another time, I was messing around with a couple of the other teenagers in the area. We were crossing the ditch and going over to the woods behind the houses. The way we cross is there's an area with two large pipes that stick out in the water. Surrounding the pipes are these rocky things that you can slide down, but also grip with your hands. They're kind of smooth and hard to hold when wet. We were coming back. The others had crossed just fine. I was the last one over. The first thing that happened that was really odd was my hand slipped and I started scared to get across when I heard someone yell my name and say very loudly in my ear to stop. I looked down and there was a snake in the water, right where I was about to put my foot. My friend came back across and got rid of the snake. I got home okay. When I went to take a shower later that night, I looked at my arm and I had a hard handprint bruise on my arm. I don't know if it was one of the ghosts from the house, but something stopped me from falling and from getting bitten by the snake. So, I guess even if the ghosts scare me, they're looking out for me too. I was born in Singapore in 1951 to British and Australian parents. We lived in various cities in Malaysia during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. In 1957, we arrived in Kuala Lumpur, where we stayed until mid-1975. We moved into a company-owned house at Freeman Road, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The history of the house is as follows. It and the house next door, number 17, were built just before World War II by the late Dato Gunlay Take, a then well-known architect, who became an early Malaysian High Commissioner to either Australia or Canada. He built them for his daughters. During World War II, the two houses, along with a large semi-detached house immediately behind, on what was then known as Gulfview Road, were taken over by the Japanese Army's secret police, known as the Kenta Pai, equivalent of the Nazi Gestapo. The two houses behind were used as Kampai Thai offices, and the three in jail in Freeman became senior military officers' brothels. The women in the brothels were both Asian and European, the latter being drawn from a pool of captured civilians and military nurses. Comfort women was the term used by the Japanese. Male military POWs were used as gardeners and cooks, etc. These staff, if they fell from favor, were executed, and some were obviously buried in the ground surrounding the houses, as some years later, we did find scattered human remains when excavating the gardens for our new orchid beds. On the advice of our doctor, who identified them as human in origin, we quietly reburied the remains. He said that if word got out as to what we had found, we would never get any Malay or Chinese domestic staff to work for us. After the war, the houses were returned to their owners who, knowing what the Japanese had used them for, promptly put them up for sale. They were all bought by large companies at bargain prices, who used them to house senior expatriate staff. Gunlay Take was no different, and in 1947, sold his two houses to the company my father worked for. The two company houses were 3-bedroom houses of 2 stories, double brick construction. There was also a long narrow room, forming a roof over the carport at the front door. This room was to play a significant role in what we were to experience over the following 10 years. In our house, this room was turned into a large walk-in linen press and storage area. To enter it, one would take one step down. When we moved into the house in early 1957, the first thing my mother noticed was that this room was extremely cold, as if it was air-conditioned. In tropical Malaysia, a non-air-conditioned room this cold is not even practical. Our dogs would never go into this room, and when passing the entrance to that room, always hurried past with tails between their legs. Nobody would really stay in that room for very long. It had a very uncomfortable atmosphere. However, sometimes after running around and playing and getting very hot, I would go and sit on the step at the entrance to the room to cool off. I was 5 years old and knew nothing about ghosts at this time. The main bedroom, on the extreme right-hand side of the upstairs part of the house, as one faced out towards the main road, had its own full bathroom, and the other two, also upstairs, shared a bathroom via separate doors leading from the bedrooms to the bathroom. These latter two were adjoining each other. One was on the extreme left-hand side of the house, and the other